Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir-Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdinas siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladina an'amta alayhim. Ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Ameen. On behalf of Imam Tariq Al-Amin, the resident Imam of Masjid Al-Taqwa, our Taleem Committee Chair, Dr. Aisha El-Amin, committee members, Dr. Gloria Bashir. I want to welcome you to today's Taleem. The topic of our discussion today is back to school, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Praise be to Allah. We seek his help and his forgiveness. We seek refuge with Allah from the evil of our own souls and from our bad deeds. Whomsoever Allah guides will never be led astray, and whomsoever Allah leaves astray, no one can guide. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, the one having no partner. And I bear witness that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is his slave and his messenger. Again, I want to thank you all for being here. We have a small group this morning, this afternoon, but that's okay. I am recording this session of Taleem, and we will be uploading this recording to our YouTube channel. So inshallah, if you find anything useful for someone who cannot be here with us today, encourage them to visit our YouTube channel and watch the recording of today's Taleem. As I said just a few minutes ago, the topic of today's discussion is back to school. We are now fully into the month of August. Most schools, if they haven't already started, will be starting next week or shortly thereafter. And so the objective of today's presentation is to help folks begin to think about what to expect as we launch into this upcoming school year. There are some things to be excited about relative to this upcoming year, but there are also some things to be concerned about. And so I want to try to paint as comprehensive a picture as possible so that if you are a parent, if you are a caretaker of children who are not your own, if you are a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, if you know of someone who's taking care of school-aged children, we all should be concerned about some of the things that I'm going to be sharing with you today. But we should also be very excited about the prospects of returning back to school. And I'm going to be very precise with my language. I didn't say returning back to normal because normal was not good enough for most of our children. So while we put a lot of blame at the feet of the pandemic for the condition of our schools, the inequities that exist within our schools, the challenges that a lot of our students are facing in our schools, we know, those of us who have been in the field of education, know that many of these problems existed prior to the pandemic. And what the pandemic did was actually intensify the ills that were already present. And so I want to be clear that just as we cannot blame, for example, Donald Trump for racism, we can't blame the pandemic for the myriad problems that exist within our school systems. And so today I'm going to walk us through what I'm calling the good, the bad, and the ugly as we think about entering into this upcoming school year. I believe, looking at the names that are present in this Zoom room, I believe that I know most of you. But for those that don't know me, my name is Lionel Allen Jr. I'm a proud member of the Masjid Al-Taqwa community for the past 6 years. Very fortunate to be a part of this beautiful community. I'm an educator by trade. I've spent more than half of my life working in schools or on behalf of schools. I started out as a teacher assistant in a summer program almost 25 years ago. And from there, I became a classroom history teacher. I taught history at the high school level. I've been an assistant principal. I've been a turnaround principal. In fact, I was the nation's first No Child Left Behind turnaround principal. I was appointed by Chicago Public School CEO at that time, Arnie Duncan, to lead the city's first turnaround under that model which ended up being the first of its kind in the nation. And then from there, I went and I led a network of all male, all African-American charter high schools here in the city of Chicago. And currently I serve as a clinical assistant professor of education and policy studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. My background has prepared me to do the very important work that I'm engaged in now, which really falls along the lines of principal development. So I help train aspiring school leaders who are pursuing a doctorate in education. And I also help support in-service leaders through the provision of professional development and coaching. I also started an educational consulting firm about 4 years ago called Ed Leaders Matter. And the focus of our work is to develop high quality school leaders that can do the very important work of leading schools, particularly schools in highly challenging communities. So that's who I am. And so as I walk you through my presentation today, and I'm going to open it up for questions towards the end, but as I walk you through the presentation today, what I'm sharing with you is a manifestation of the work that I've done over the last 2 to 3 years in supporting school leaders throughout this very difficult time. Right, leading a school in the midst of a global crisis is tremendously difficult. And because of my work as both a professor and as a consultant, I've had the opportunity to work with a myriad of leaders from across the state of Illinois, and even in places like Wisconsin. I'm working with the principal with Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I'm working with a number of leaders in downstate Illinois, although the bulk of my work actually is focusing in on school leaders who are in the Chicagoland area. So this is what you're going to see now is essentially what I've learned from engaging with school leaders and engaging with teachers across the state of Illinois, and again, even beyond that, when we take a more regional view of the work that I've done. So I just want to give you that context so that you know that I'm not just up here making things up, that this is actually based on work that I've been involved in for the last 3 years, particularly around working with teachers and leaders around the pandemic, but my 20-something years of experience in the field of education. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen and begin the presentation. And I want to just preface, some of what I'm going to say with, you're not going to agree with everything that I'm going to share with you today, and that's fine. I don't expect you to take everything that I present as if it's the word, because again, this is based on my experiences, and I have not been in every school in the state of Illinois, and I have not worked with every leader in the state of Illinois. So take everything I say with a little bit of a grain of salt, knowing that it's not fully representative of every leader's experience, every school's experience. But I've worked with enough, I think, to be able to share some of the patterns and trends that I've noticed in the field. Let me start with the good, right? Let's talk about what we should be excited about as it relates to the start of the school year. The first thing that I want us to acknowledge is that we should just be excited that schools are opening back up, because despite mask fatigue and people sort of pushing the global pandemic in the background, we are still living in the midst of a pandemic. COVID is still real. People are still contracting COVID. People are still passing COVID on. We're still seeing it pop up in summer camps and daycares and nursery schools and things like that. So despite the fact that the COVID-19 remains the backdrop of our experiences, we should still be very excited that kids are going back to school. And what I'm seeing is an excitement from teachers and an excitement from school leaders as well. No one signed up to work in a school to do it remotely. That's not what principals wanted to do. That's not what teachers want to do, right? When we think about the educative process, it is a highly personalized process, right? It is in some ways a highly individualistic process. And so it requires being in community with your students in order to impart new knowledge upon them. And it's very difficult to do that in a remote or virtual setting, even if technology isn't an issue. And we know that for so many of our children and so many of our families, technology was a major barrier, or the lack of technology, I should say, was a major barrier to students being able to fully engage in the academic process. So the fact that the schools are opening and that classrooms are going to be open, and that there's going to be some learning happening in brick and mortar, facilities, is something to be very excited about. And I think that, most teachers that I've come into contact with, most leaders that I've come into contact with, are just super excited about the prospects of being able to see their kids again, to be able to hug their students, to be able to interact with them, to build a sense of community within their school. So that's something to be very, very excited about. And I know that, such a big part of the school experience is the socializing piece, right? And so what we're finding is that students are super excited because they have an opportunity now, just as they did last year, but even more so this year, because there were still some kind of constraints that legislated the school experience for many of our students. To be able to go back and to be a little bit more free to socialize with their peers is something that I know students are excited about, and we should be excited about as well. So that's something to celebrate, and that's, again, one part of this upcoming school year that we should be excited and happy about. Something else to keep in mind that we should be excited about, and I say this knowing that not every school and not every school district is fully committed to this the way they should be. But there's a renewed focus on addressing the social and emotional health and learning of students. Schools and school districts are starting to see this as an absolute imperative. Whereas before, you had some schools that were, sort of using SEL as a buzzword, right? They were saying they were doing it, but they really weren't doing it. They weren't investing the kinds of resources that are necessary to make sure that the social and emotional needs of children are being met. What we're starting to see now is school districts actually invest real funding in this, meaning that they are, purchasing curriculum materials, that they are hiring additional social workers, that they are hiring what we call interventionists, both behavior and academic interventionists, that are helping students sort of navigate the complexities of school. School is not the way it used to be, right? When we think about, for most of us who are on this call, when we think about what school used to be like and the pressures that we were under, it really pales in comparison to the kinds of pressure that our school-aged children are under today. The advent of social media has fundamentally changed the way students interact with each other. It changes the way they feel about themselves. It has an impact on their self-esteem, their academic identity. I like to remind people that comparison is the thief of joy, right? When you start to compare yourself to others and what they have versus what you have, it's very easy to kind of get stuck in that sunken place. And what we have now is a world that's sort of driven by comparison. Everything is, watch me, watch what I'm doing. I'm doing this and I'm on this vacation and I'm having this experience and I'm eating this for dinner. And so kids are constantly sort of bombarded with these messages and images that make them feel less about themselves, right? And so one of the things that we have to be intentional about in our schools, but also at home, is making sure that we are combating these messages that they're receiving that's really having a negative impact on how they see themselves, right? And so it's important that schools continue to invest in ways that they haven't invested before, but they continue to invest in the social and emotional needs of children. And so one of the things that's exciting, one of the goods that's coming out of this sort of anticipation for this upcoming school year is this renewed focus on SEL health. Some schools are even carving out, protected time for teachers and counselors and such to lead students through SEL type activities to make sure that students are able to, again, navigate the complexities of being a student in these days and times, which again, we know is a very difficult prospect for some kids. Another good that I want to call out is this renewed focus on equity. As I said before, it was no secret that schools struggled with the existence of profound inequities in their schools prior to the pandemic, right? So anybody who says that, well, the pandemic is the reason why African American and Latino kids are struggling, the reason why poor kids are struggling, they're lying, right? That's just not true, and they know it's not true, but they say it anyway, right? So one of the things that what happened during the pandemic was, because students were confined to remote learning, it brought teachers and principals into the homes of the students that they were serving, right? So maybe you thought you knew about the challenges that the student was facing, but now you really knew, because you were, trying to deliver instruction remotely to a student who's at home, and you have a chance to see what their home looks like. How many people live in a one-bedroom apartment? Do they have a safe place, a quiet space to study, right? Or are they in a situation where they're trying to share a one-bedroom apartment with 4 or 5 siblings, and they're all trying to log into remote learning at the same time, right? Like, you got a chance to see. You had students, and I saw this with my own eyes, you had students who were engaging in their remote classes from the bathroom, because that was the quietest, safest place that they could, log in, right? It might be the one room in the house that they got the best internet connectivity, right? So we were brought in to our children's homes and got a chance to see what was going on. Now, we those of us who have been in the field of education and were really committed to our students, who have made home visits and had connected with parents in authentic ways, like, we already knew that was the situation that many of our students were in. But now people who, who kind of were on the fence about how committed they were to serving their students authentically, now they were fully brought into the fray, and they can see it with their own eyes. So one of the things to be excited about with this upcoming school year is that schools and school districts are taking a sort of a renewed focus on equity. And not every school is doing it well, not every district is doing it well, right? But they are acknowledging that these performance gaps that we're seeing and how our students achieve academically, their rates of attendance, the levels of student engagement, even their post-secondary outcomes, in large part is driven by some of the factors, some of the barriers that they face, both within the school but also outside of the school as well. So it's exciting to see districts, for example, have an equity policy or equity statement. And unfortunately, in many cases, it might just be words on paper, right? Like, I'm not saying that every district is living up to their equity frameworks that they've rolled out, but the conversations are starting. And there's also more accountability at the state level, right, on districts to make sure that they are addressing inequities that exist within their district, right? So you can't just go along and get along anymore and just maintain status quo. That districts are being held accountable now for disparate achievement outcomes amongst demographic groups of students. There's something that comes out of the University of Chicago. It's a survey that they administer to schools across the state of Illinois. It's called the 5 Essentials Survey. And I'm not going to get fully into the nuts and bolts of it, but it essentially is a framework that helps to predict how effective a school is going to perform. And it sort of is based off of these 5 factors: leadership, collaborative teachers, ambitious instruction, supportive environment, and involved families. And there's a bank of questions that when parents and students and teachers, when they fill out the survey, there's a bank of questions that help us to understand how a school is performing in each of these 5 key areas. The theory here is that a school that is high performing in 3 of these 5 key areas is considered well organized and therefore more likely to improve student outcomes, right? They are situated for school improvement, right? And schools who don't are schools that struggle and more than likely will not be able to realize significant school improvement. But what's changed because of this renewed focus on equity is now you can disaggregate survey responses based on race and gender. Why is this important? It's important because a lot of times when parents, for example, are looking at and trying to make a decision on the school that they want to send their kid to, what they do is they look at the overall performance of the school. And I had this conversation a lot of times with friends of mine who were moving out to the suburbs for what they thought were going to be better schools. So they would say to me, hey, we're considering moving out to fill in the blank suburb. And I'll say, well, why? And they say, well, the schools are much better. And I will always respond with, are they much better for your child? Are they much better for your child? So I would encourage them to look at the school's performance data based on race and gender. So, for example, if they were moving out to the suburbs and they had an African-American boy, right? They had a son who happened to be African-American, and they're moving out to the burbs, and they're moving out to this suburb because they think that the schools are better. I would encourage them to look at the data and disaggregate it based on how well African-American boys are doing at that school. And what you'll often find is, even though it might be overall a higher performing school, that students of color that went to that school, African-American boys and girls and Latino boys and girls, oftentimes struggle just as much as they would struggle in a traditional Chicago public school, for example. And so what's exciting with this sort of renewed focus on equity is that a lot of the data that schools are going to have to answer to has been already disaggregated. They can no longer hide the performance of their historically marginalized students. That information is going to be made public. So when you look at, for example, the 5 essential data, you won't just be looking at what everybody is saying about the school, what all the teachers and what all of the families are saying about it. You can look at it and say, okay, what are Black families saying about this school? How do Black families feel about this district, right? What do Black students think about their experiences at this particular school? And what that allows us to do is to make a much more informed decision when we are trying to figure out what's the best fit for our students, particularly students of color. You are able to make a much more informed decision about that. And we have a much more comprehensive view of how schools are performing, particularly as it relates to African-American and Latino children. And for so long, people weren't paying attention to that data. As long as the white kids were doing well, everybody was fine with that. Everybody was satisfied with that level of performance. And now we want to make sure that we are pulling back the layers a little bit, that we're looking beyond the wallpaper and actually seeing how specific groups of students are performing, particularly African-American and Latino students. So those are things to be excited about, right? Excited to be back in school and in person, right? For another year, excited about the focus on SEL, and excited about this renewed focus on equity. Now let's get to the bad. Let's get to the bad. One of the things that we have to be concerned about relative to this upcoming school year is the lack of socialization that students have had over the last 2 years. So one of the things that I've noticed and I've had principals complain about and teachers complain about is, once we transition to in-person learning, students really struggle with interacting with each other in productive ways. And so you had schools that hadn't had fights in years were now averaging, 5-6 fights a day, right? You had some of your quote unquote high performing schools where students have to test to get into them, right? They were now dealing with students who were engaged in, really severe misconduct, whether they be fights or cursing out teachers or engaging in other behaviors that, weren't expected and weren't normal in that particular setting. And what you're finding is students were coming back to school, they were short-tempered and stressed out. Many of them didn't want to be back for a lot of different reasons that we won't get into right now. Many teachers didn't want to be back. And so teachers were also short-tempered. And so when you have a teacher and a student who both have short tempers and they are interacting with each other in person for the first time in 18 to 24 months, right? The outcome of that interaction, was oftentimes very negative, right? And so you had situations where, students were being disrespectful. They were being disrespectful to their teachers. Teachers were sometimes being disrespectful to students. You had students, again, who were, fighting and, engaging in these verbal altercations with each other. And so students are really struggling with sort of the socialization aspects of school. Why? Because many of them hadn't done it. You had students who were starting their freshman year in a high school who hadn't been in school for almost 2 years. So, we know that the transition, for example, to ninth grade is a tough one. In normal circumstances, kids struggle with the transition from middle school to high school. So you couple that already difficult transition, right, with the fact that I haven't really been in a normal school setting in 2 years, right? And all of the uncertainty, the stress, the anxiety associated with now I'm a high school student is amplified tenfold. And so you have students who fundamentally weren't ready for school, right? They weren't ready for the social aspects of it. And we saw it manifest itself in a lot of different ways. And one of them was just really disruptive behavior that they were engaged in. So that's something to keep in mind. It's one of the things that we have to be a little concerned about, right? As we transition back into this new year, under the guise that we're returning back to normal, even though last year was a relatively normal school year, minus a few issues here and there, students still have not had an opportunity to experience school the way we experienced it, the way their maybe older siblings experienced it because of the existence of the pandemic. And let me say this, I was a principal of a school in Inglewood. Every Monday, in some ways, was like starting over, right? So when a student came back from a weekend, we had to be very intentional about, on Monday morning, making sure that students understood the expectations of being in school, right? Because they hadn't been in school for a whole weekend, and who knows the kinds of things that, they were exposed to or were engaged in. So every Monday was like, like starting over. Every long weekend was like starting over. When they would come back from winter break, we would start, that Monday after winter break, reminding students of, how to navigate this space, right? And not in the authoritarian kind of, hyper focus on discipline kind of way, but just saying, hey, like, we know you've been relaxing for 2 weeks and you've gotten out of school mode. Like, let me remind you, this is what we expect when you cross the threshold here, at this school. And so I can't imagine being a principal and students being gone for almost 2 years, right? And what that socialization process was like, right? How do we sort of help students understand the do's and don'ts of school? That's one of the things that made school, particularly schooling in historically challenging neighborhoods, difficult at times, right? Because you had to reacclimate students to the kind of structures that make school what it is. And so we found that to be very difficult, and we see it happening across the city of Chicago, across the state, where students are really just struggling to be back in school, right? They have become comfortable with, being in school, so to speak, while being in their pajamas, logging into class from the comfort of their bed. And now they got to get up and actually come to school and sit in the desk, and that transition for some students proved to be too much, right? Their willingness to sort of do school, right, decline in many ways because of the circumstances that they have been unfortunately placed in as being a student during the pandemic. So that's something to be concerned about, right? The stress and the short tempers that students are dealing with. Another concern that we need to sort of have at the front of our mind, the top of our mind, is the realities of this teacher shortage, right? There's a lot of districts are just struggling to find teachers. I don't know a school, and I'm working with at least 20 schools right now across the state of Illinois. I don't have one school that's fully staffed, not one. Everybody is looking for teachers right now. And maybe you all don't know this, but if you are a principal and you're still looking for teachers in August, you know that the pickings are real slim. Like, the superstars have already signed on with someone else. So if you're still hiring at this point in the year, you're more than likely just looking for a warm body, right? Meaning that you're compromising the quality of the individual that you are hiring because you just want to make sure that you have an adult, a certified adult, a licensed adult, assigned to that classroom on day one. And that's the unfortunate reality of leading a school during these types of really unfortunate situations. You got a lot of people who are running from the profession. You got a lot of teachers resign. You have far fewer teachers, or far fewer candidates, that are entering into teacher preparation programs. We are expecting no less than 2 million teacher vacancies by 2024, right? Because you're going to hit, a lot of folks are going to be retiring. in the next, year and a half, 2 years, right? And you're going to have a lot of folks who are deciding that they're going to resign. They don't want to do this anymore. And you couple that with the fact that we're already seeing far fewer students enrolled in teacher education programs around the country. And that's sort of the perfect storm of all those factors is going to make it very difficult for schools to find high quality teachers, right? And so we got to be concerned about that we're starting this school year with a number of schools who just don't have enough staff members. And I'm saying teachers, but we're talking across the board. So we're not just talking about teachers, we're talking about lunchroom staff, right? We're talking about special education assistants. We're talking about people who occupy very important roles. Their title might not say teacher, but it's still a tremendously important role that they're occupying. And we're finding that it's hard to find people to fill those roles, right? I know there's been a lot of talk about the Great Resignation and how it's hard for businesses, for example, to find, employees. The same applies to our schools. So we need to be concerned about that your child or your nephew or your niece or your neighbor's children, might be going into a school where, they might not have fully certified or fully licensed teachers in every class, right? They might have a substitute for a large portion of the school year. And it's not ideal, but many of our principals are forced to do that because of the circumstances that they're in. Something else to be concerned about is the learning loss that our students have and are going to be affected by. I can speak for my own child. I had two kids at the time, one in high school and one in elementary school, who were students during the pandemic. One of them spent all of first grade, or most of first grade and most of second grade in remote learning, and it absolutely did not work for him. Right? He was not a kid that could sit in front of a computer all day, and no first grader can, to be quite honest with you. First grade is probably the most important grade. It's the grade where students where they learn the most, is where they develop the most in terms of their literacy skills. The amount of reading growth that a first grader is supposed to realize during their first grade year is far greater than any other grade, throughout the rest of their schooling. It's just a really important year. And for him to have to sit in front of a computer to try to learn and grow, it just didn't work. And so there's the reality that students are coming back to school with a significant amount of learning loss. And the bad is not the learning loss itself, is that many schools and school districts aren't responding to that learning loss, right? That many schools have sort of resumed business as usual. And so one of the things to be concerned about is what happens when students are overwhelmed by what they don't know, what they have not experienced in schools. And if schools and teachers aren't responding to the fact that, hey, this fourth grader that I now have in my class didn't really have a first grade year, didn't really have a second grade year, and all of those foundational literacy and mathematics skills that they should have gained proficiency in, they don't have proficiency in. What does that mean for me as a fourth grade teacher? How do I redesign my lessons and shift my focus to address the realities of the students I have in front of them? If they aren't thinking in that way, if they aren't asking those questions, this learning loss will be compounded year after year after year, right? It's very similar to students that we sometimes refer to as Katrina kids. And these were students who, were primary age children who attended schools in and around New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. These were students who had their entire year kind of undermined and ruined and were shipped off to different places to live in Texas and Mississippi and places like that. But they didn't learn, they didn't really have real school for almost 2 years. So when those students became middle schoolers, they struggled academically because, again, a lot of the foundational skills that they should have gained proficiency in as primary age students, they didn't have it, right? And so they knew, everybody around that area knew this is a Katrina kid, right? Because this kid didn't get what they needed to get when they were in first and second grade. And so if schools aren't responding to that very real learning loss, right? They aren't responding in authentic ways, then again, the learning loss is compounded year after year after year, right? And what we know is, for example, if a student isn't able to read to learn, right, by the time they're in third grade, it makes it very difficult for them to realize success beyond third grade, right? Now, there's reading and there's reading to learn. By third grade, students should be reading to learn, meaning that they should be able to read something and gain some information from it, right? And if they aren't able to do that because of whatever the reason is, it increases the likelihood they're going to struggle throughout the rest of their academic experience. And so we're going to have a bunch of students, right, who, because of this learning loss, are going to continue to struggle. And that's something for us to be concerned about. Now let's talk about the ugly. Let's talk about the ugly. So just to quickly review, in terms of the good, we're excited to be back in school, excited to be back in person, right? We're excited that there's a renewed focus on SEL. We're excited about the renewed focus on equity, right? That gives us joy and excitement about this year. When we think about the bad, we've talked about how students are struggling with the social aspects of school because they haven't been in each other's company for many years without interruption. We talked about the teacher shortage, and we talked about the learning loss that many students have experienced. Let's talk about the ugly. I'm going to go back to what we just talked about in the learning loss. Let me explain why this is ugly. Yes, it's true that many students are grappling with significant learning loss. My fear, and the reason why this is ugly, is because a lot of schools have adopted a deficit view of their students. In other words, they're going to use this learning loss as justification to have increasingly low expectations for students, right? They're going to have increasingly low expectations for students, meaning that they won't be exposing students to grade level content, which again, what it does is perpetuates a situation where not only is the learning loss compounded, right, because schools aren't responding appropriately to the academic deficiencies that students are walking in with, they're going to dumb it down even more because of learning loss. So it's really a double-edged sword here. So we, on one hand, we do have to acknowledge that students don't have all the foundational skills that they need. On the other hand, we still, as educators, have to ensure that we are exposing them to grade level content and scaffolding it so they can find ways to access it. But what often happens is we'll say, well, this kid didn't get this in first grade. They might be a fourth grader, right? They're a fourth grader, but this kid didn't get this in first grade. So you go back and you teach that fourth grade kid as if they're a first grader. That's the flawed approach to this, right? We can't allow that to happen. We have to be concerned about schools and school districts dumbing down the curriculum in the name of addressing learning loss, because that's not how learning loss is addressed, right? We have to find ways to expose students to grade level content and give them the tools that they need to be able to access that new material, even if they are lacking some foundational skills. And I know it's possible because I was a teacher and I had to do it. I had students in high school who were functionally illiterate. Right, I had sophomores who couldn't read. When I was a principal, I had 7th and 8th graders who couldn't recognize the letters in their name. That wasn't an excuse for me to dumb down the curriculum. I didn't say to my 7th grader, right, who couldn't recognize the letters in his name, I didn't give him a pre-K book and say, well, this is more along the lines of what you can handle. No, we had to find ways to provide differentiated instruction so that that young man, right, could not only learn how to identify the letters in his name, but begin to understand and be exposed to 7th grade concepts. Otherwise, we were cheating them out of his academic experience. And so the ugly here is that a lot of our students, under the guise of we're addressing their deficiencies, right, are going to be made to feel less than, are going to struggle even more in school, and going to have their learning loss even further compounded because they won't be exposed to grade level material. So we got to be mindful of that. And I encourage you, if you have children, or if you know someone who has children and their children are struggling, like, you want to make sure that they are still being given access to the full depth and breadth of the academic experience, meaning that they should not be, if they're a 6th grader, they should not be sitting in the classroom only doing work that's appropriate for a 3rd grader. And it happens. And if you don't believe me, you have to see it for yourself, right? I've been in schools before the pandemic. I've walked in high school classrooms, juniors, for example, and those students were sitting in that classroom and they were working on worksheets, right, that were appropriate for 5th graders, right? And the teachers, you know, so the justification for that was, well, you know, Michael was struggling to read. Well, okay. Every young man in this room is struggling to read. That does not justify you giving them 5th grade work, right? Like, that's the easy way out. And very rarely when we do that, do students develop a higher academic self-esteem. If anything, it crushes their self-esteem. It disempowers them. It makes them feel like they're less than and that they can't. right? And that's totally unacceptable. And so I want us to be mindful of, as you think about the experiences of your children, of the children that you know, your relatives, children, et cetera, make sure that despite whatever learning loss they might have experienced, that schools are still holding them to high expectations for learning. During the pandemic, there was a lot of rhetoric about we're going to reimagine schools, we're going to do some things different, that the way we were doing school before, right, just was not effective, and we're going to, turn schools upside down, and we're going to be different places. Well, the ugly is that that has not happened, not even a little bit, right? Schools have resumed business as usual. We have not, I can't think of one example, and maybe I'm sure there's some out there, but I can't think of one example of a school that has fundamentally changed the way in which they do the business of school, right? Because adults are comfortable with how we used to do it, how we've always done it. And that's always been the rub. That's always been the tension, right? There's a tension between doing what's best for students and doing what makes adults comfortable. And 9 times out of 10, whatever makes adults comfortable is what wins. And so we have not reimagined schools at all, despite all of that talk, all that rhetoric about how we have to start doing things differently, that kids are missing out on a quality education because of the way we have structured schools and the schools and the systems that govern schools. Despite all of that fancy talk, nothing has changed, right? And that's really unfortunate, and it's really frustrating for me because I was hoping, that in the words of Winston Churchill, I was hoping that we would not let this good crisis go to waste. I was hoping that because of what was revealed as a result of the pandemic and as a result of remote learning, that we would take that opportunity and to do something different, and we absolutely did not. And so it's really unfortunate, right? So, the schedule, the school schedule is still the same. The way we put students in grade levels is still the same. The way we assess students is still the same. We're still using high-stakes testing to determine a student's performance level, which is crazy to me considering that they haven't had real instruction really in 3 years in some cases. But we haven't changed any of that stuff, right? That's super frustrating for me as an educator and as a parent, quite frankly, right? I'm watching schools just kind of almost not even acknowledge that we just had a situation where for 2 years kids were out of school. Like it just doesn't make sense to me. It's almost frightening, right? But again, people were so much in a rush to resume to what they call normalcy. It's like, well, let's just do what we've always been doing. And to me, that's pretty tragic. So that's an ugly part of what's coming up, is that you're going to see schools structured the same way they were structured in 2018. Even though these kids aren't the same kids. They are not the same kids. The teachers aren't the same teachers. So we're going back and we're leveraging strategies and processes and systems in 2022, like we were in 2018, then we're going to see kids really struggle because of that, because we aren't adapting to their needs. We aren't modifying what we do for what's best for students. And that's really unfortunate, right? The last thing I'll share with you as it relates to the ugly, and then I'll open it up if folks have questions, is that schools are caught in the middle of this ideological battle. So just as in, public political discourse, right? We're having conversations and debates about what's true and what's not true, what's real and what's not real. Same thing is happening in our schools. And I want to be clear about this now. Sometimes we make the assumption that when we start talking about these ideological debates, right, that we think that they are constrained or only are happening in the South. Now, what's happening in some of our southern states is ridiculous, right? I mean, there's a story that just came out of Florida where this special education teacher was preparing his classroom for the start of the school year, and a district representative came in and started tearing down pictures off of his bulletin board, pictures of Barack Obama and Harriet Tubman and other, African-American historical figures. And the reasoning given was this isn't developmentally appropriate, right? So you have, and that's happening all over this. It's happening in Texas. You got a bunch of teachers resigning in Texas because they can't teach anything or say anything that could be labeled or mislabeled as critical race theory. Any of us who know anything about critical race theory know that that's not even touched really until you get to college, and in most cases, grad school. And I'm not going to get into what critical race theory is and all that kind of stuff, but trust that it rarely, if ever, happens before college, before undergrad. But you know, the right wing has made critical race theory the thing, and it is coming up now in elementary school board meetings, and it's coming up in parent complaints. I have a buddy of mine who's a superintendent, and you know, he just received the email from a parent last week. Can you justify, or can you explain whether or not anything related to critical race theory is happening in my son's classroom? The son is in 4th grade. Like, nobody's talking about critical race theory in 4th grade. Right, that's just not realistic, but that's the thing that they turn to. And most of the time, people don't even know what it is. You ask, okay, you have a concern about critical race theory. Can you tell me what it is or how you understand it? They can't explain how they even understand what critical race theory is. So schools are caught in this battle. But let me just say that it's not just in the southern states. That superintendent I just told you about is a superintendent of a suburban Chicago elementary school district, right? So even in historically liberal Evanston, Illinois, right, there are parents there that are pushing back on any curricular resources, any conversations in school that quote unquote make white children feel bad about themselves, right? So anything about slavery, anything about racism, Jim Crow, segregation, any of those things, you can't even talk about Ruby Bridges, right, in some of these spaces without parents being upset, thinking that, you know, that teachers are making white kids feel bad, even though it's a fair and accurate representation of schools in America, right? So schools are caught in the middle, and some schools, you can't even talk about identity, right? You can't even talk about identity. You can't even talk about, well, as students, like, what identities do you bring with you as a student in this classroom? They don't even want to have those conversations, right? And so it's really unfortunate that that teachers don't have the freedom and the autonomy, right, to be able to teach some of these concepts, and what these really high level concepts, but teach them in a way that helps shape understanding for some of the young people in these classrooms. And that's really unfortunate. And I'm not even talking about, I haven't even touched on that this whole idea, should we be reading books to our primary kids about families that have 2 mommies or 2 daddies? Like, that's a whole nother conversation when you start to bring in the LGBTQIA community into the conversation. That just enriches the rage that a lot of folks have, right, around these things. And I get it, like, parents want to be careful about what their kids are exposed to, but you know, there are boards, there are parent groups that, again, don't even want, you know, teachers talking about Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, right? So we're not even talking about super radical like concepts or topics. We're talking about things that in the past have been generally acceptable to teach in our schools, right? And again, you're talking, or you're listening to someone who, you know, I have real issues the way history has been taught in our schools as a former history teacher. I'm not even talking about like the radical kind of parts that people would consider to be radical concepts and topics that's often covered or could be covered in American history. I'm not even talking about those things, like teaching about lynching, and like, I'm not even going there. I'm talking about things that, again, have been historically accepted by teachers and by, you know, districts to teach, topics to teach, and those things are now under fire. And so the problem here is that not only are people growing more and more concerned about what they can and cannot teach, and these feelings of fear, right? People are walking away from the profession for fear of getting in trouble for teaching certain things. Like, that's part of it. But we also know that our students' academic experiences are being cheapened, right? Because of this ideological battle, because of the fact that you have a contingency of parents now who are saying that SEL shouldn't even be taught in schools, right? Everything has become politicized, right? And so that's something that's super ugly that we need to be concerned about, that we need to be paying attention to. And again, the fact that we are in Chicago, in the Chicagoland area, does not exempt us from this ideological battle. As a matter of fact, you know, if, for example, if Pritzker loses the election, the gubernatorial election, and the Republicans take that seat, rest assured that that governor is going to be pushing for things to change in our schools, and what's taught in our schools and the curriculum that's acceptable in our schools is going to change as a result of his election, right? Because a lot of this stuff falls along party lines. And so we have to be concerned about that. We want to make sure we're taking greater ownership of what's happening in our schools, that we aren't taking a passive approach to our child's education, and that we are being mindful and paying attention to what's happening, and asking our kids when they come home from school, like, tell me about your experience. Not how was school today? Every kid's gonna be like, all right, it was fine, cool, whatever. No, I mean actually asking questions so that you have a much better understanding of what your child's experience, or your relatives' experiences are in school, because it's a different day and it's a different time. So I hope that some of this was helpful. If I said anything that offended anyone, if I said anything that was wrong, if I misspoke in any way, know that comes from me. And whatever good came with this presentation came from Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I thank you all for being here today. I'm going to stop my share. And if you have a question or comment, feel free to take yourself off mute, or to put your comment in the chat. I see Brother Bill Chambers has raised his hand. Go ahead, Brother Bill. Assalamu alaikum.
Salam. First, thank you for that terrific and passionate presentation. That really brought up a whole lot of issues that I've been thinking about. I wanted to make just a comment and then ask you a question. Like the last point that you made about this whole thing about critical race theory and pulling out books like Maya Angelou or something, like African American books out of schools. That's also happening in some of the suburbs here. Like one of the things where I live in Elmhurst, there's you always have to look out for these parent groups that are called like freedom of education, I don't know, whatever, and they're doing a lot of educating around that. And then also, like, these people are running for the school board, right? And you got to kind of look at, but that is, I absolutely agree with you. A lot of that's happening around here. The question I had for you was, I was really interested in what you were talking about the importance of a lot of the students being behind, right? And how the schools are going to react to that. And I know my daughter, who's the special ed teacher in CPS, one of the things she was finding out already, even before the pandemic, is that a lot of the schools weren't following the special ed rules. What they're supposed to do and their IEPs and all that kind of thing. And it seems to me, especially if you have a special ed kid, I can't even imagine they're going to do that even more. You know what I mean? With everyone coming back, because like you said, they don't have enough assistants, they don't have enough people.
Right.
But my question was, you were talking about that whole idea of like pulling back what they're going to be teaching some of the kids because they're behind. What's your advice if you have a son or daughter or a grandchild or whatever, that you get the sense that this is what's happening? They're not giving them age appropriate or grade appropriate material. What do you do about that?
So I'm hearing two questions in your question. The first is like, how do you know? One of the things that I encourage all parents and caretakers of children to do is to look at the types of work tasks that their child is bringing home every day. Like looking at book bag. Don't just ask the student what they're doing every day, or ask your child what they're doing every day. Go and look at the work. Look at the types of problems they've been asked to solve. Look at the level of the text that they've been asked to read. Look at the kinds of assessments that they're given. So that's going to require you to, again, take a more active approach to what's happening by actually diagnosing the kinds of things that kids are bringing. And like parents know if something appears to be too easy for their child. So that's the first thing. The second thing, in terms of what you do, you have to reach out to that child's teacher and get a better sense of how that material is being used, right? So it's one thing to give a child something from an earlier grade as a review, because I used to do that all the time. I just want to see what they know and what they're struggling with. But that can't be what I am using to actually teach, right? So I might be using it as a review, but I'm also going to be making sure that I'm exposing that child to grade level appropriate material. So you want to ask, hey, I noticed that the assignment that, you gave, Malik yesterday, seemed to be, really easy for him. It seemed to be something that he would have, been working on when he was in second or third grade. I understand you might be using that to get a sense of what he, struggling with and what he's proficient in, but can you tell me what your plan is to make sure that, he is exposed to, if he's a fifth grader, fifth grade material, and you want to listen to what that teacher's response. How are you want to ask the teacher, how are you making sure that my child is going to be exposed to fifth grade learning standards? And you want to get a sense of what that teacher's plan is. And if they don't have a plan, right, or if they start stuttering like they haven't even thought about it, right, then you want to let them know that the expectation is that they are being exposed, they being the children in the classroom, are being exposed to material that is appropriate. If you have a child that has an IEP, you got to ask questions to ensure that contract, the IEP is a contract with the school district, to make sure that the district is living up to the terms of that contract, right? If they're supposed to see a social worker, are they seeing a social worker for the amount of minutes that they're supposed to see the social worker for? If they're supposed to have some sort of pullout or resource, is the child being pulled out for resource? And if not, then you want to have conversations first with the teacher, because I believe in, respecting chain of command. And then if necessary, going to the assistant principal and then going to the principal to make sure that the child's needs are being met. Parents who are active, parents who ask the right questions, parents who are involved, those are the parents that have their needs met, right? Because look, here's the reality of public education. They're dealing with, you got so many kids on their roster. There's so many issues that teachers are dealing with. Every kid is not going to get the kind of attention they deserve. So when schools are sort of deciding, well, who's going to get the attention, it's always going to be the parents, right? It's always going to be the parents that are the most vocal, that are asking the best questions, that are the most involved. That's just how it is. It's not right. It's not fair, right? But that's how it is, right? Schools are making political decisions, and they're always going to make sure that they are being responsive to the parents that have A, the political and social capital in the community, and B, the parents who are the most active, the most vocal, and the ones who are asking the most questions. And so parents who take a passive approach to the education of their children will never effectively have their children's needs met, right? Because you're basing the child's education on someone's goodwill, right? And we just don't want to do that, not in these days and times. It's too much at stake. Thanks for your question, Brother Bill.
So that was great.
Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you all so much. I don't want to hold you. It is after 2 o'clock, and Taleem's, end at 2 o'clock. I thank you for being here, with us on this day. I know everybody has so many other things they can do, so I really appreciate your presence. And again, I hope that you found this to be informative and in some ways helpful as we think about preparing for the upcoming school year. I'm going to stop the recording now, but I want to, say assalamu